The Boy Who Cleaned the Dead. Episode 1. The Map Beneath the Stones. Some people believe the dead stay buried, that graves are final, that stone and earth can hold secrets forever. Tony knew better. He'd spent enough time among the forgotten, scrubbing names into legibility, pulling ivy from Victorian angels, resetting headstones knocked crooked by time, to understand that burial is never permanent. The earth shifts, rain erodes, and sometimes the past doesn't want to stay hidden. On a gray Thursday in London, Tony's brush struck something hollow behind a headstone dated 1891. Inside a rust-flecked case, he found a map. Not treasure, not gold. Something older. Something that knew his name before he'd ever spoken it. What he didn't know yet was that opening that case had already marked him. That shadows had been waiting. That Scotland held doors meant to stay sealed. This is the story of a boy who cleaned graves and found something that refused to rest. This is the boy who cleaned the dead. Tony learned early that London didn't care whether it saw you or not. The buses came either way. The rain fell without asking. People hurried past with their collars up and their eyes down, and if you slipped between them quietly enough, the city let you exist without comment. That was how Tony moved through life. Quietly, carefully, like a shadow that had learned not to expect the sun. He was 19. Tall, broad-shouldered from years of lifting more than boys his age ever should. His face might have turned heads if it had ever learned to look up. Dark hair, always cut short to save money. Strong hands, a body shaped by work, not gym mirrors or admiration. At college, he wasn't invisible, but he wasn't seen either. Teachers knew his name because he handed his work in on time. Classmates knew him because he never caused trouble. Girls noticed him sometimes, in that passing way, then moved on to boys who had cars, trainers that glowed white, or lives that weren't already weighed down by responsibility. Tony didn't blame them. After school, he didn't hang around the gates or loiter outside chicken shops. He caught the train back west, back to a narrow flat above a closed-down off-license near Acton, where his mum slept in snatches between shifts and exhaustion, lived like an extra tenant. His mum, Maria, worked 2 waitress jobs, one cafe that opened before dawn, another restaurant that didn't close until nearly midnight. She smiled, too much for someone who slept too little. She apologized for things that weren't her fault. Tony learned to cook early, learned to budget, learned to fold worry into neat, quiet corners of his mind. And on his days off from college, he cleaned graves. The cemetery was old. Older than the flats, older than the buses, older even than most of London's stories. A place where the city's noise dulled at the edges, where time slowed and names outlasted faces. Tony liked it there, not because it was morbid, because it was honest. The dead didn't pretend to be anything else. He worked 20 hours a week for a small maintenance company that handled neglected plots, scrubbing stone, clearing ivy, resetting markers knocked crooked by weather or age. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and the silence suited him. He learned the shapes of grief in stone, the sharp edges of Victorian angels, the soft erosion of letters rubbed smooth by rain, the difference between a grave that was visited and one the world had forgotten. On that particular Thursday, the sky hung low and gray, pressing down on the cemetery like a held breath. Tony was halfway through cleaning an older family plot. No flowers, no recent offerings, when his brush struck something that didn't feel like stone. It sounded hollow. He frowned and knelt, brushing away dirt at the base of the headstone. The name carved above him was barely legible now, but beneath the grime, he could make out the year, 1891. Tony leaned closer. There, tucked into a narrow recess behind the base, was a thin metal case. Old, rust-flecked, sealed tight. His heart gave a small, foolish thump. People didn't leave things behind graves. Not like that. He hesitated. Then, like he always did, he reached for the truth instead of the fear. The case came free, with a soft scrape. He wiped it clean with his sleeve, fingers trembling despite himself, and twisted it open. Inside was paper, old paper, yellowed, folded carefully, edges reinforced with thread, and on it, drawn in precise, confident lines, was a map. Not a street map, not a plan, something older, symbols, markings, notes written in a slanted hand that felt deliberate, educated. Along one edge, a phrase stood out, ink darker than the rest. What was hidden must be earned. Tony swallowed. At the bottom corner, barely visible, was the outline of an island. Scotland. That night, he couldn't sleep. The map lay spread across the small kitchen table, held down at the corners by chipped mugs and unopened bills. Maria slept in the bedroom, her breathing shallow, already exhausted for tomorrow. Tony traced the inked lines again and again. He wasn't an expert, but he read constantly. History books from charity shops, old adventure novels, stories of explorers who left nothing behind but questions and scars. This wasn't decorative. It wasn't a prank. It was a guide. Coordinates scratched faintly into the margins. Symbols that repeated, almost like warnings. And one word that kept appearing near the northern edge of the island. Vault. By morning, Tony had made a decision. He didn't tell his mom. Not yet. But he told two friends from college. Liam, who knew trains and routes like other people knew football stats, and Zara, who read languages the way some people read faces. They sat in the park, the map unfolded between them, leaves skittering past like they were trying to listen. "This is real," Zara said quietly. Liam glanced up. "You know, people would kill for something like this, yeah?" Tony folded the map carefully and slipped it back into his jacket. "I know," he said. And for the first time in his life, London felt too small to hold what he'd found. 3 days later, in a quiet office far from Acton, an older man adjusted his glasses as a report landed on his desk. "Recovered?" he asked. "No," came the reply. "Missing." The man smiled thinly. Then someone's finally found it. A few days later, Tony didn't tell his mom. Not because he didn't trust her, because he could already hear the way her worry would sound when it tried to hide behind a smile. He imagined Maria's hands pausing halfway through washing a plate, her eyes widening a little as she looked from the map to him and back again, her brain sprinting through 1,000 worst-case endings. Rent, food, safety, police, people who did not play fair. And then she'd say, "Anthony, please." Not angry, just scared. So Tony did what he always did. He carried it. The next few days became an exercise in ordinary life, pretending it wasn't sitting on a trapdoor. College in the mornings, A-levels and lectures, fluorescent lights, teachers speaking as if the world was built on essays and deadlines. Tony sat at the back, wrote notes, answered when asked, and kept his face blank while his mind kept slipping back to the map folded inside his jacket like it had a pulse. He noticed things now, the way certain classmates drifted into groups like magnets, while he remained in orbit no one bothered to name. The way laughter in the corridor always sounded a bit distant, like it belonged to someone else's film. And outside, London kept doing London. The same commuters, the same sirens, the same drizzle that never decided whether it wanted to commit. But Tony felt changed, like he'd stepped half an inch out of the world everyone else walked in. On Saturday, he went back to the cemetery for his shift. Not because he needed the money, though he did, because he needed to see the headstone again. He needed to prove to himself that he hadn't dreamed it. The plot was still there, still neglected, still quiet. The stone still bore its half-erased name, like a secret it had been forced to share. Tony worked slowly, eyes scanning the ground, the base, the surrounding stones. Nothing else. No second case. No obvious clue. Just cold earth and a damp wind moving through bare branches. He was packing up his brush when he felt it. That slight pressure between the shoulder blades. The sensation of being watched. Tony didn't turn quickly. He'd learned, living in London, that quickness could make you look like prey. Instead, he capped the cleaner bottle, tightened his gloves, and stood up as if stretching. Then he looked. Across the cemetery path, near a line of older graves, a man stood still. He wasn't dressed like the mourners that sometimes came through, heavy with flowers and quiet tears. He wore a long, dark coat, the kind that looked expensive without shouting about it. His hair was neat. His hands were in his pockets. And he was staring directly at Tony. Tony's stomach tightened. London had all kinds of strange people in it. That didn't mean danger. But something about this man wasn't random. The man didn't move, didn't wave, didn't pretend to check a phone. He simply watched. Tony forced himself to look away first, pretending to adjust his bag strap. When he looked back, the man was gone. No footsteps, no retreating silhouette, just empty path and old stones. Tony stood there too long, listening to the quiet. Then he walked out of the cemetery with his shoulders set, like he could carry the sky if he had to. That evening, Tony sat at the tiny kitchen table with Liam and Zara on a video call. Liam's camera shook slightly, like he'd propped his phone against something unstable. Zara was in her room, shelves behind her stacked with books that looked like they could double as weapons. Tony told them about the man. Liam's expression changed instantly. Yeah, nah. That's not normal. Zara leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Did he look like he worked there? No, Tony said. Not staff. Not a visitor. So what are you thinking? Liam asked. Tony hesitated, then said it. I think the map isn't just old. He swallowed. I think it's wanted. Liam let out a low whistle. And you're just carrying it around London, like it's a Tesco receipt. Tony didn't smile. Zara's voice softened. Tony, if someone else knows you have it, you have to be careful. I am careful, Tony said, but the words tasted like a lie. Careful was what he'd been his whole life. Careful was survival. This was something else. Liam scratched his jaw. Okay, new plan. We assume someone's hunting it. We move smart. Zara nodded. And we make a copy. Tony blinked. A copy? Photos, Zara said. Every detail. Front, back, the margins, everything. If you lose it, you're not losing everything. Tony's chest loosened a little, as if someone had unhooked a clasp. Right, he said. Yeah. Okay. Liam pointed at the screen. Also, Scotland. How are you getting there? Don't tell me you're thinking of just winging it. Tony looked down at his hands. He'd been saving quietly for months already. Little notes folded into a jar. Coin piles. The kind of money that never looked impressive, but took effort to gather. It wasn't much, but it could do something. I've got a bit, he said. Not loads. Liam's grin flickered. I know trains, yeah? I can get you cheap tickets if you're flexible. Zara's eyes flicked away, like she was thinking through possibilities. And I can help decode some of the symbols. The writing, it's not modern. Tony felt warmth creep into his chest, surprising him. He wasn't used to people helping him without wanting something back. Why are you two doing this? He asked, before he could stop himself. Liam shrugged, as if it was obvious. Because you're our mate. Zara gave a small smile. And because stories like this don't happen to people like us. They happen in books. Tony's throat tightened. He looked away quickly, so they wouldn't see it. Okay, he said. Then we do it properly. For the next week, Tony lived 2 lives. One life was ordinary. College, assignments. His mom's tired kiss on the cheek when she stumbled home. The microwave meals he heated up at midnight because neither of them had the energy for anything else. The other life was folded into his pocket. The map. He photographed it under Zara's instruction. Bright light, flat angles, close-ups of each symbol and note. Zara sent him messages late at night with questions, guesses, theories. Liam sent links to train routes and cheap timings. His texts full of confidence he probably didn't actually feel. Tony started running again in the mornings. Not for looks, for stamina, for breath, for the instinctive sense that if he had to sprint, he didn't want his lungs to betray him. And all the while, he watched. He didn't see the man from the cemetery again, but twice. He saw a dark car parked near the road outside his estate longer than it needed to be. Once, he caught someone staring at him on the train, eyes sliding away too late. And once, when he left the cemetery after a late shift, he found the lock on his supply shed slightly twisted, like someone had tried it. Tony didn't tell his mom, but he started sleeping with his phone beside his pillow, just in case. On the Thursday before he planned to leave, Maria finally noticed something. Not the map, not the fear, but the weight. The way Tony carried himself, like a man trying to hold back a tide. She was in the kitchen, wearing her waitress uniform, hair tied back, applying lipstick that made her look less tired than she really was. Tony was making tea. Maria looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You're doing too much, Anik." Tony froze. She didn't use the Tagalog word often. Not here. Not in Acton, surrounded by people who didn't pronounce things right. But when she did, it meant something mattered. "I'm fine," Tony said. Maria's eyes softened. "You always say that." Tony didn't know what to do with that. So he poured the tea like the steam could hide him. Maria stepped closer and touched his arm. Her fingers were warm, calloused from work. "Whatever it is," she said, "you can tell me." Tony wanted to. He wanted to tell her everything. The map, Scotland, the possibility of something big, something that could change their lives. But he pictured her fear again. The way it would carve itself into her face and never leave. So he shook his head gently. "It's just school," he lied. "And work?" Maria held his gaze, like she could see through him, then she sighed. "Okay," she said, not believing him at all. "Just don't be brave alone." Tony nodded. and she left for her shift, the door shutting behind her with a soft final click. Tony stood in the quiet kitchen for a long time after she was gone. Friday morning, he bought the ticket. One way to Edinburgh. Cheap, early, uncomfortable, but real. His hand hovered over the payment button longer than it should have. This money could have gone to bills, food, rent. But Tony thought of his mom's hands. Always busy. He thought of the tiredness in her smile. He thought of the flat ceiling above his bed, the way it never changed no matter how hard he worked. And he thought of the line on the map. What was hidden must be earned. He pressed pay. The confirmation email landed in his inbox like a small spark. The day he left, London was gray and impatient. As if it was annoyed he thought he could escape it. Tony left before sunrise, carrying a backpack that held only what he needed: spare clothes, charger, a cheap rain jacket, snacks Zara insisted on, and the map sealed inside a plastic folder like it deserved protection from the world. He told his mom he was going to a study session. It tasted bitter, but if this worked, he promised himself he would make it right. At the station, Liam met him on the platform. Liam was dressed like he belonged in a music video. Even at 6 in the morning. Hoodie, clean trainers, that grin he wore, like armor. He clapped Tony on the shoulder. "You sure about this?" Tony nodded. Liam's grin faltered, just slightly. "Then listen. You get there, you keep your head. Don't trust anyone too fast." Tony looked at him. "You coming?" Liam shook his head, but his eyes looked apologetic. "Can't. Family stuff. But I'm with you, yeah? I'm with you." He pulled Tony into a quick hug, the kind lads did when they didn't want it to look too emotional. Then he stepped back, forcing a smile. "Send me pics of castles?" And that. Tony managed a small laugh. Yeah, Zara wasn't there. She'd messaged him at 4 in the morning. "If you see the symbol that looks like a 3-pronged fork, message me immediately. It's older than the others. It matters." Tony read it twice. Then he boarded. The train pulled out with a shudder, as if even the rails were reluctant to let him go. London slipped away in layers: estate blocks, warehouses, graffiti-splashed bridges, then quieter suburbs, then fields that felt unreal after so much concrete. Tony sat by the window, watching the world change. At first, he felt relief. Then, slowly, something else crept in, a sense that the further north he went, the more exposed he became. Less crowd to vanish into, less noise to hide beneath. And somewhere around the point, where the landscape opened into wide stretches of winter trees and mist, Tony noticed the man sitting across the aisle. Dark coat, neat hair, hands in pockets, the same stillness. Tony's blood went cold. The man didn't stare, not directly, but Tony could feel him watching, the way you could feel a heat source without touching it. Tony lowered his gaze, pretending to scroll his phone. His fingers tightened around it so hard they almost hurt. He didn't move, didn't run, didn't make a scene. He waited. At the next stop, Tony stood up casually, as if going to the toilet. He walked down the carriage, heart hammering, and slipped into the next carriage instead, taking a seat near a family with 2 kids and too many bags. He looked back through the glass divider. The man was still in his seat. Still. Then, after a moment, the man stood and walked. Not hurried, not panicked, just certain, straight toward Tony's new carriage. Tony's mouth went dry, so it wasn't coincidence. It was pursuit. By the time the train rolled into Edinburgh Waverley, the sky had turned the color of cold steel. Tony stepped onto the platform with the crowd, forcing his breathing to stay steady. Suitcases clattered. Announcements echoed. People moved with purpose, like the station was a living machine. Tony kept his backpack tight against his shoulders. He didn't look behind him. Not yet. He moved with the flow, eyes scanning for exits, signs, a place to disappear for a second and think. He climbed a set of stairs, emerging into the station's upper level, where shops and corridors branched like a maze. He finally allowed himself one glance back. He saw the dark coat. The man had followed him off the train. Tony's heart kicked hard. Then the man lifted a hand to his ear, as if speaking quietly to someone. And Tony realized something worse. The man wasn't alone. Tony turned fast, slipping into the crowd. He didn't run yet. Running too early made you stand out. He moved toward a side exit and slipped into the street. Edinburgh hit him like a different world. Stone buildings, narrow streets, the air sharper, cleaner. The city felt older than London, like it remembered things London had buried. Tony kept walking, forcing himself to look like he belonged. He checked reflections in shop windows, in a glass door. Yes, the man was still behind him. Not close, but steady. Tony turned a corner, then another, and the streets narrowed. The crowd thinned. He didn't like that. He needed people, noise, witnesses. Tony cut back toward busier streets, but as he rounded a corner near a row of stone steps, a second figure stepped into view ahead. A woman, this time. Late 20s, maybe. Blonde hair, tied back. Long coat. She held a phone in her hand, but her eyes weren't on the screen. They were on Tony. Tony stopped so suddenly, he almost stumbled. The woman smiled. Not friendly, not cruel, just confident, like someone who'd found what they'd come for. Tony's mouth went dry. The street behind him was now too quiet, and when he looked back, the dark-coated man had closed the distance. Tony was boxed in, not by violence, by certainty. The woman spoke first, voice calm as rain. "Tony," she said, as if they were old friends, "we need to talk about what you found in London." Tony's hand tightened on his backpack strap. He didn't answer. The woman's eyes flicked to the bag. Then she smiled, slightly wider. "Don't worry," she said. "We're not here to hurt you." She paused, letting the silence sharpen. "We're here to buy." Tony did not answer. Silence had been his armor long before this moment. Silence gave other people room to reveal themselves. The woman didn't rush him. She stood comfortably on the stone pavement, weight settled evenly, eyes steady. The man behind Tony stopped a few paces back, close enough to be a presence, but not a threat. Yet, people passed at the end of the street, laughter drifting in from somewhere brighter, busier. Here, between the tall stone buildings, the air felt held. Tony adjusted his grip on his backpack strap. "How do you know my name?" he asked. The woman smiled again, just a touch apologetic. "Because you didn't hide very well." That stung. Tony forced his voice to stay even. "I don't have anything to sell." She tilted her head. "Everyone does. Sometimes they just don't know its value yet." The man behind him cleared his throat quietly. Tony glanced sideways, measuring distance, exits, angles. The steps to his left led upward, but narrowed quickly. The street ahead opened into foot traffic, but the woman blocked the clean line. He thought of running. Then he thought of the train carriage, of certainty, of being followed without hurry. These people were used to chasing. Tony straightened. "I'm not interested," he said. "Move." The woman studied him for a moment longer. Then she stepped aside, just enough. Tony didn't hesitate. He walked. Not fast, not slow, just decisive. He passed her shoulder, close enough to smell something floral and expensive, and moved toward the open street. Behind him, the man did not follow. Neither did the woman. That scared him more than pursuit. Tony didn't stop walking until his lungs started to ache. He followed the crowds, ducking into busier streets, weaving between tourists and commuters, until faces blurred together and the sense of being singled out faded slightly. When he finally ducked into a small cafe, hands shaking as he ordered the cheapest tea on the board, he chose a seat near the window and watched the street like it might betray him. Nothing happened. No dark coat. No blonde woman. Just Edinburgh, indifferent and old. Tony exhaled slowly. His phone buzzed. "Liam, you good?" Tony in Edinburgh. Not alone. Liam. "What do you mean not?" "Tony, I'll explain later." He slid the phone face down. His tea arrived. He didn't drink it. His mind replayed the woman's words. "You didn't hide very well." Tony had grown up learning how to disappear. So what had he missed? He found a hostel tucked between two taller buildings, the kind that smelled faintly of detergent and shared history. He paid cash, avoided eye contact, and took the key without questions. His room was small. Narrow bed, metal locker, a single window looking out onto a brick wall, damp with moss. It felt safe enough. Tony sat on the bed and unzipped his backpack. The map waited inside, folded, carefully. He spread it across the mattress, heart thudding. Under the hostel's dim light, the ink looked darker than before. The symbols sharper. Tony leaned closer. "That's new," he murmured. A marking near the northern coast, one he was sure hadn't stood out before, seemed clearer now. Almost awake. He touched it lightly. The paper was warm. Tony pulled his hand back, like he'd been burned. That wasn't possible. Paper didn't warm itself. He swallowed, pulse racing, and forced himself to breathe. This was stress, travel, fear. He told himself that until the map shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. A fine line extended from the marking, faint as a whisper, pointing inland. Tony stared. The map wasn't just a record. It was responding. His phone buzzed again. "Zara, Tony, please tell me you're safe." "Tony, I am. For now." "Zara, did anyone follow you?" "Tony, yes. They knew my name." 3 dots appeared, vanished, reappeared. "Zara, okay. Listen carefully. The symbols you sent, some of them aren't geographical. They're conditional." "Tony, conditional how?" "Zara, they change when certain criteria are met. Location, time, proximity." Tony stared at the map. "Proximity," he whispered. "Tony, Zara, I think it knows. I'm here." "Zara, then you need to move carefully. Scotland doesn't hide things randomly." Tony thought of the cemetery. of the grave that had guarded the map for over a century. "I don't think this was ever meant to stay buried," he said quietly. That night, Tony dreamed of stone doors and cold wind. He dreamed of footsteps echoing behind him, always measured, never rushed. He dreamed of Scotland watching him back. Morning came gray and sharp. Tony left the hostel early, blending into the city's rhythm. He bought a cheap map from a corner shop. Not the old one, the ordinary kind. Something to look normal. Tourist enough. He followed the new line on the map loosely, letting instinct guide him. The city changed as he walked. Modern gave way to old. Old gave way to ancient. Stone walls rose higher. Streets narrowed. The air smelled faintly of rain and history. Tony found himself near a cluster of older buildings, one of which drew his attention immediately. Not because it was impressive, but because it felt familiar. A small, weathered structure stood apart from the others, its stone darkened with age. A plaque near the door marked it as a former chapel, no longer in use. Tony slowed. The map in his bag felt heavier. He circled the building once, pretending to be interested in his phone. Then he saw it. Carved into the stone near the base of the chapel wall, half hidden by ivy, was a symbol. 3-pronged, like a fork. Tony's breath caught. He took a photo and sent it immediately. "Tony, Zara." "Now?" The reply came almost instantly. "Zara? That's it. Tony, do not ignore this. That symbol predates modern Scotland. It's tied to vault markers. Tony, vault like storage. Zara, vault like safekeeping." Tony's pulse hammered. He knelt, pretending to tie his shoe, and brushed ivy aside. More markings lay beneath. This wasn't the destination. It was a signpost. Tony stood and turned and nearly collided with the blonde woman. She stepped back smoothly, smile already in place. "There you are," she said. Tony's stomach dropped. Behind her, across the narrow street, the dark-coated man leaned casually against a railing. And farther back, Tony's breath caught. Another figure watched from a cafe window. They hadn't lost him. They'd let him lead. The woman followed his gaze and nodded slightly. "You see," she said gently, "you're very good at finding things." Tony's jaw clenched. "What do you want?" She studied him, then said, "A partnership." Tony laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You followed me across the country." "Yes." "You boxed me in." "Yes." "And now you want to be partners?" She shrugged. Treasure has a habit of bringing out urgency. Tony thought of his mom, of Acton, of graves and quiet work and tired smiles. "What if I say no?" he asked. The woman's smile thinned, but didn't disappear. "Then you'll continue alone," she said. "And that would be unfortunate." Tony took a slow breath. "What's your name?" he asked. She seemed surprised by the question. Then she answered, "Eleanor." "And him?" Tony nodded toward the man. "Marcus?" Tony filed the names away. "I'll think about it," he said. Eleanor's eyebrow rose. "You don't have time to think." Tony met her gaze. "Steady now. I've had 19 years of not having choices," he said. "I'm taking one now." For a moment, Eleanor looked like she might argue. Then she smiled again. "Very well," she said. "We'll be nearby." She stepped aside. Marcus didn't move, but his eyes tracked Tony carefully as Tony walked past. This time, Tony didn't look back. He didn't go far, just far enough to breathe. Tony ducked into a public library, the kind where tourists rarely lingered. He found a seat between shelves and sat very still, listening to his heartbeat slow. He pulled the map out again. The line had extended further, northwest, into the highlands. Tony closed his eyes. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about something old waking up. Something that had chosen him not because he was special, but because no one else would have noticed the grave. Tony opened his eyes. He packed the map away, and he began planning how to disappear again. The library smelled of dust, paper, and old warmth. Tony liked it immediately. Libraries were neutral ground. No one watched too closely. Everyone pretended not to exist together. He chose a seat with his back to a shelf, eyes on the entrance, and stayed still long enough for his breathing to slow. His heart had been racing for hours now, since the train, since the first time his name had been spoken by a stranger. He took the map out again. This time, he didn't flinch when it felt warm. He expected it. The line pointing northwest had grown clearer, not thicker exactly, more confident, as if it was no longer asking him to follow, but assuming he would. Tony pressed his lips together. "Right," he whispered. "You win." He folded the map and slid it away. The problem wasn't Eleanor and Marcus. The problem was that they weren't wrong. He couldn't stay in Edinburgh. Cities made it easy to be tracked. Cameras, patterns, predictable routes. If the map was leading him north, then north was where he had the advantage. Base, unpredictability, old ground. He didn't leave the library right away. Instead, Tony did something that surprised even him. He researched. He pulled books at random. Local history, old maps, travel guides. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he trusted the instinct that had led him this far. Scotland wasn't one thing. It was layers. Roman roads buried under sheep tracks. Old chapels built over older sites. Forts that had been abandoned, rebuilt, renamed, forgotten. Vaults didn't always mean gold. Sometimes they meant records, relics, promises. Tony scribbled notes in the margins of a cheap notebook. Place names that repeated. Symbols that echoed the ones on his map. Mentions of protected ground and sealed places. By midday, he had a rough direction. The highlands, sparse trains, fewer roads, less certainty. Tony checked his balance. Enough for a bus north. Maybe a cheap room, if he was careful. Not enough to waste time. He packed up, waited 5 full minutes, then left through a side exit. Eleanor noticed his absence within the hour. She stood where he'd last walked away, arms folded loosely, eyes scanning the street with interest rather than frustration. "He's clever," she said. Marcus didn't answer immediately. "He's scared?" "Of course he is," Eleanor replied. "That's what makes him dangerous." Marcus frowned slightly. "He's just a boy." Eleanor's gaze sharpened. "No. He's someone the map chose." She turned away. "We go north." Tony boarded the bus with his hood up and his head down. The city peeled away quickly this time. Stone gave way to green. Buildings thinned. Roads stretched longer between places that looked like they'd been waiting centuries for someone to pass through. The further north they went, the quieter it became. Tony rested his forehead against the cool glass and watched Scotland unfold. This wasn't London. There were no crowds to disappear into, but there was something else. Presence. The land felt aware, not alive in the way people were alive, but attentive, like an old listener who remembered more than it spoke. Tony slept in short bursts. Each time he woke, the map felt heavier, as if distance added weight. He got off the bus in a town small enough that no one rushed. A handful of shops, a pub, a post office, hills rising behind it like patient guardians. Tony took a deep breath. He didn't feel chased here. That scared him more than being followed. He bought supplies carefully. Water, bread, something warm to wear. He avoided conversation, paid in cash, and left without lingering. The road north narrowed quickly. Eventually, Tony left it altogether. He followed a trail that wasn't marked on his tourist map, guided instead by the pull in his chest, the same instinct that had told him to check behind the grave, that had warned him on the train. The wind picked up. Clouds moved faster here, shadows racing across the ground, like thoughts that couldn't settle. Tony stopped when he reached the stone. It wasn't tall. It wasn't impressive. Just a squat marker, half buried in earth, its surface worn smooth by rain and time. But the symbol carved into it was unmistakable. 3 prongs. Tony knelt. As his hand hovered near the stone, the map inside his bag pulsed. Once, sharp and undeniable, he touched the stone. The air shifted, not dramatically. No noise, no light, just pressure, like the land had leaned in. Tony pulled his hand back, breath shallow. "This is a lock," he whispered. "Not a door. Not yet. A warning." He didn't hear Eleanor approach. He felt her. "You're ahead of schedule," she said calmly. Tony stood slowly. She wasn't smiling this time. "You followed me," he said. "We followed the map," Eleanor corrected. Marcus stood farther back, watching the hills like they might move. "This place," Tony said. "It doesn't want you here." Eleanor glanced at the stone, interest flickering. "Oh, I think it's been waiting for someone like me for a very long time." Tony shook his head. "You don't listen." Eleanor sighed softly. "And you think you do?" She stepped closer, careful not to touch the stone. "Listen to me, Tony," she said. "Whatever is locked away out here, it's not meant for one person. It's bigger than you. Bigger than your life in London. Bigger than your mother's sacrifices." Tony's chest burned. "Don't talk about her." Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "Then help me. Let us do this properly." Tony laughed quietly. "You don't know what properly means," he said. The wind rose suddenly, sharp and cold. The stone vibrated under Tony's hand. Eleanor froze. Marcus took a step back. "What did you do?" Eleanor asked. Tony stared at the stone, heart hammering. "I didn't do anything," he said honestly. The map burned against his side. A sound rose from the hills. Not a voice, not an animal, but a low, distant resonance, like something vast shifting its weight. Eleanor's confidence cracked, just slightly. "This wasn't supposed to happen yet," she muttered. Tony stepped away from the stone. The pressure eased. The sound faded. Silence rushed back in. Tony exhaled shakily. "Yeah," he said. That's because it's not waiting for you. Eleanor looked at him differently now, not as a resource, but as a variable. We'll talk again, she said finally. She turned and walked away, Marcus following without question. Tony watched them disappear into the landscape. This time, he didn't feel relief. He felt the ground watching him. As dusk settled, Tony made camp badly. He'd never done this before. His knots were wrong. His fire pit uneven. His food barely warm. But he was alone. And for the first time since London, no one knew exactly where he was. Tony sat with his back to a rock, map spread across his knees. A new marking had appeared. Not a line, a symbol. An eye. Open. Tony swallowed. This isn't just a treasure, he whispered. It never had been. He stared into the darkening hills. Somewhere out there, something ancient had noticed him, and it hadn't decided yet whether that was good or bad. Tony woke before the sun, not because he meant to, because the land felt louder. The wind had died overnight, but the silence was heavier now, pressed down against the hills like a palm. Even the birds seemed cautious, as if they'd been told to wait. Tony lay still inside his flimsy camp setup, blinking at the gray edge of dawn, listening for anything that didn't belong. Nothing moved, and yet the feeling remained, like being watched from very far away. He sat up slowly, joints stiff from sleeping on ground that had no interest in comfort, and reached for his bag. The map was already warm, not heat from his body, not the sun. Warm like breath. Tony swallowed, unfolded it, and felt his stomach dip. The eye symbol that had appeared last night was still there, darker now, clearer, inked with a confidence the rest of the lines didn't have. Worse than that, there was writing beneath it. Tony stared at it, unable to accept what he was seeing, because the handwriting was not his, and it hadn't been there yesterday. The words were faint, as if written with a dying pen, but legible. First rule: do not open what you cannot close. Tony's mouth went dry. He looked around, half expecting someone to step out from behind the rocks with a smirk and a marker pen. No one, just heather, stone, and ancient patience. He read it again, then a third time. First rule: like there were more. Like this wasn't a map to treasure. It was an instruction manual for something dangerous. Tony folded the map carefully and shoved it back into the plastic sleeve, as if the warning might leak out. He breathed out, slow. Okay, he whispered into the dawn. Okay, I hear you. And then, because he'd been 19 for only a year and still believed stubbornness counted as courage, he added, but I still have to try. He packed quickly. No fire today. No extra time spent fiddling with knots. No lingering. The hills were open, and open meant visible. Tony checked his phone. No signal. He wasn't surprised. He was also relieved. If he couldn't be reached, neither could the people hunting him. He moved toward the marker stone where the three-pronged symbol was carved, keeping his steps light, eyes sweeping the horizon. Morning in the Highlands didn't arrive politely. It crept in through the mist, turning the world into layers, near ground sharp, mid-distance blurred, far distance swallowed. The stone sat as it had yesterday, ordinary. And yet when Tony stepped within a few meters, the air tightened again, like the land was drawing a slow breath. He stopped. Right, he muttered. So this is the part where I'm meant to be sensible. He reached into his bag and pulled out the map. The paper warmed instantly, He held it up, comparing it to the landscape. The drawn line pointed beyond the stone, toward a rise in the hills that looked at first glance like any other. But now that he stared, he noticed what he hadn't before. That hill's slope was slightly too clean, its curve too smooth, as if it had been shaped by hands that knew geometry and secrecy. A bunker, Tony thought. No, older than that. A chamber, a vault. He hesitated, then took one step. The map warmed further. He took another. The warmth became almost uncomfortable. Not burning, but urgent, like holding something alive. Tony stopped again and looked back. Nothing. No Eleanor. No Marcus. No figures on distant ridgelines. Just mist shifting, like slow smoke. He continued. An hour later, he reached the hill. Up close, the smoothness was undeniable. The earth here wasn't wild. It had been trained. He walked the perimeter, scanning the grass for stone edges, cracks, seams. Nothing obvious. If a door existed, it didn't advertise itself. Tony sat on a rock and pulled the map out again. The eye symbol seemed to stare right back at him. Below it, the warning remained. First rule. He felt his pulse in his throat. Where's the handle? He whispered. The map responded. Not with movement, with weight. It grew heavier in his hands. Subtly, impossibly, until Tony had to brace his elbows against his knees to hold it steady. Then, like a thought becoming an idea, a new mark appeared near the hill on the map. A small circle, a dot, and beside it, another line of writing, faint but clear. The key, I said, not metal. Tony stared. A key, not metal. He swallowed. A person? He said softly. The map warmed, as if agreeing. Tony's mind raced. What did he have that could count as a key? He had nothing special. No ring. No heirloom. No secret family history. Just work. Hands. The cemetery. The grave. The fact he had noticed what others didn't. Tony's eyes flicked back to the hill. If the key wasn't metal, maybe it wasn't an object at all. Maybe it was an act, a willingness, a proof. He stood, walked closer, and then he saw it. A shallow dip in the ground near the base of the hill, where grass grew differently, thinner, as if the soil below wasn't natural. Tony knelt. He brushed the grass aside. Stone, a slab, almost flush with the earth. At the center of it, barely visible, was a groove shaped like a palm, not carved, crudely, carved carefully, as if whoever made it understood hands. Tony's stomach twisted. This was it. He looked down at his own hand. Strong, work-worn, still young. He thought of his mum's hands, tired and cracked from hot plates and dishwater. He thought of Acton, of bills, of years passing, no matter what you wanted. And he thought of the first rule. Do not open what you cannot close. Tony drew a slow breath. Then he placed his hand into the groove. The stone pulsed. Not light, not sound. A vibration, deep and steady, like the hill had a heartbeat. Tony's fingers went numb. He tried to pull away. He couldn't. The groove held him. The air tightened so sharply, his ears popped. Then the world went quiet. Not normal, quiet. A quiet so complete, it felt like the sound had been turned off. Tony's breath fogged in front of him, and even that looked too loud. He stared at his trapped hand, panic rising. Then the map, inside his open bag, fluttered without wind. Its pages flipped. Once, twice. The eye symbol darkened, and the hill, impossibly, shifted. A seam appeared in the earth where there had been none. A line, clean as a knife cut, ran across the base of the hill. A door. Tony's heart hammered. The vibration grew stronger. The stone under his hand warmed. Then, suddenly, his fingers released. Tony snatched his hand back and stumbled away, breathing hard. The door was still there, half visible, half buried, waiting. Tony stared at it in disbelief. He'd done it. He'd opened something sealed for over a century, and nothing had exploded. No trap, no monsters, just a door, just an invitation. Tony's knees almost gave. He sat heavily on the grass, laughing once, short and disbelieving. Then his laughter died, because the map, still open in his bag, had changed again. A new sentence appeared beneath the first rule. The handwriting was sharper now, darker, as if whoever wrote it had stepped closer. Second rule, if you enter, you will not be alone. Tony's blood went cold. He looked up at the hills. The mist was thinning. And now, far off, on a ridge he hadn't noticed before, a silhouette stood perfectly still, watching. Tony's breath caught. It wasn't Eleanor. Too tall. Not Marcus. Wrong shape. Not a hiker either. No backpack, no movement, no curiosity. Just a figure. Upright, unmoving, as if carved into the horizon. Tony squinted. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't react. It simply watched. Tony's mouth went dry. He looked back at the door, then back at the figure. The second rule echoed in his mind. If you enter, you will not be alone. Tony whispered, "Is that what you mean?" His phone buzzed suddenly. He flinched so hard his hand jerked. Signal. Here? He stared at the screen. A message came through from an unknown number. No profile. No name. Just text. "We can see the door. Step away from it, Tony." His heart slammed against his ribs. Eleanor. Or someone else. Tony's fingers hovered over the screen. But he didn't reply. Another message arrived instantly, as if they were watching him type nothing. "You don't know what's inside." Tony swallowed. He looked up. Again, the silhouette on the ridge was still there. He looked down at the map. First rule. Second rule. Ends the door. Waiting. Tony's mind flashed to Maria, back in Acton, probably halfway through a shift, probably thinking her son was studying. He thought of the bills on the kitchen table. He thought of being 19 and already tired. He thought of a life where nothing changed unless you made it change. Tony stood. He slung his backpack on. He walked toward the door. His phone buzzed again, frantic now. Don't. Tony didn't stop. He reached the seam and pressed his palm against the earth where the line was clearest. The ground yielded slightly, like soft stone. A narrow gap opened, just enough for him to slip fingers into it. The air that leaked out was colder than the morning. Not stale, not rotten, just old, like a room that hadn't been breathed in for a long time. Tony leaned close, heart hammering. The gap widened a fraction, as if responding to his presence. He could do this. He could step inside. He could become the kind of person stories were written about, instead of the kind of person the city forgot. Then behind him, a voice carried across the grass. Calm. Close. You really shouldn't do that, Tony. Tony froze. He turned slowly. Eleanor stood 20 meters away, coat pulled tight against the wind, hair tied back, eyes sharp. Marcus was with her, and behind them, further up the rise, 2 more figures emerged from the mist. Not hikers, not tourists. Their posture was too deliberate, their stillness too practiced. Tony's mouth went dry. Eleanor's gaze flicked to the door, then to Tony, then to the map. Her expression softened into something almost pitying. You activated it, she said quietly. Of course you did. Tony's voice came out rough. How did you find me? Eleanor smiled faintly. We didn't, she said. The map did. Tony's blood turned cold. Eleanor nodded toward the ridge. You see the Watcher? She asked. Tony's stomach clenched. Yes, that's not mine, Eleanor said. Marcus shifted uneasily, eyes fixed on the distant silhouette. And if it's not ours, Eleanor continued, then it belongs to the people who built the vault. Tony's throat tightened. Eleanor took a step forward. No one is here to hurt you, she said. Not today. Tony didn't believe her. He backed toward the door without meaning to, fingers brushing the seam again. The cold air breathed out like a warning. Eleanor raised her hand, palm out. Tony, she said, voice gentle but firm, step away and we'll talk. We'll do this the right way. Tony's mind whirled. Right way meant their way. Rich way. Owned way. He thought of Acton, of Graves, of being the man of the house at 19. He looked at the door. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the Watcher on the ridge. And he realized something with sudden clarity. This wasn't a choice between safety and danger. It was a choice between being hunted outside or being tested inside. Tony drew a breath so deep it hurt. He spoke softly, not to Eleanor, but to himself. First rule, he whispered, don't open what you can't close. His hand tightened on the seam. He looked at Eleanor, eyes steady now. I didn't come here to be bought, he said. Eleanor's face hardened. Tony pulled. The door gave way with a slow, reluctant shift, opening just enough for a body to squeeze through. Cold air spilled out, thick with age. Eleanor took a step forward, urgency flashing. Tony, don't. Tony didn't answer. He slipped sideways into the gap. For a moment, the world narrowed to stone against his shoulder and darkness pressing close. Then he fell forward, into space. Not a long fall, a step, a threshold. He landed on cold stone flooring, knees bending to absorb it. The air inside was colder, cleaner, and strangely still. Behind him, the door began to close on its own. Tony twisted, reaching back. The gap narrowed. Tony shoved his hand into it, panicked. The stone resisted. The door was closing, like a decision being made. Tony forced his shoulder against the seam. It didn't budge. Then he remembered the second rule. If you enter, you will not be alone. His breath fogged in the dark. Somewhere deeper inside the chamber, a sound echoed. Not footsteps, not a growl, a single, slow exhale, as if someone had been waiting in the dark and had just realized Tony had finally arrived. Tony froze. The door sealed behind him with a soft final click, and in the darkness ahead, a voice spoke. Low, ancient, not threatening, just certain. You opened it, the voice said. Tony's heart pounded so hard he thought it might shake dust from the ceiling. The voice continued, calm as stone. Now, you must learn how to close it. This was a story run, a cinematic audio adventure built to be heard, not skimmed. If this story pulled you forward, subscribe for more journeys into hidden places, sealed doors, and moments where turning back is no longer an option. The run continues.